Hi, my name is Kijua Sanders McMurtry. I am the Vice President for Equity Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Mount Holyoke College. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm so excited to invite you into a conversation today that I'm going to call, just for the purpose of this first video, there'll be a few videos that we'll share for the Alumni Association, an anti-racism primer. I wanted to say a couple of things about this before I go forward. I know that I'm speaking with a group of alum who are, dynamic, brilliant, and so thoughtful as Mount Holyoke alum because you attended this incredibly important and timely and responsive institution that is a women's college that is gender diverse. You have a particular way of thinking about showing up in the world, and I'm really sensitive to how that has influenced the kind of content and material you're hoping to see from the college. My role is one that is fairly new. I started at Mount Holyoke in August of 2018. I had previously worked for 12 years at a women's college that was gender diverse in the Southeast. And I was recruited to come to the Northeast, to Mount Holyoke. And I said yes, as some of you have heard me say before, because I felt like this was a place that was deeply invested in doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work in a way that fulfilled the promise to so many students who we are recruiting from across the world to come to a place that values diversity, equity, inclusion, and that believes in allowing everyone to feel as though their learning experience will not be hindered by bias or bigotry or any form of harm rooted in a value system that reifies a human hierarchy. And so the work that we do in the newly formed Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which started in September of 2019, is really about taking on that charge that the American Association of Colleges and Universities has spoken of, which is jettisoning the belief in a hierarchy of human value. This belief in a hierarchy of human value we see manifest in so many ways. As many individuals who are particularly marginalized because of our gender, as evidenced by the formation of Mount Holyoke College as a women's college, really we were founded because women were excluded from higher education institutions. And so we see it as particularly important for us that we engage in conversations around transgressing gender norms, around thinking about what it means to be a more inclusive institution around gender diversity and embracing people across the spectrum of gender diversity, around addressing head-on issues of racism, homophobia, transphobia, cis-sexism, ableism, religious discrimination, and the list goes on. And so because we are an institution that has deeply committed to demonstrating this in our work and in the way that we educate students and we remain a part of a campus community, it is important that we continue to think about how to do this with intentionality and with authenticity and with a great interrogation of how we each individually unpack our own biases so that we can bring forth the notion of collective liberation for all. So I'm excited to share with you this anti-racism primer because I think in particular that it is a time for us to have this open and honest conversation. So I'll just share with you that, one of the first things I think we need to do always when we have these sorts of events is to recognize the land that was once inhabited by a group of people who were forcibly removed. And so we typically start many of our events with a land acknowledgement. We would like to begin this important civil and human rights event by acknowledging that those of us in Western Massachusetts, the land was once presided upon by the Nonotuck people. We would also like to acknowledge the neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohican and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Please consider the land where you reside and who the original inhabitants of that land who were most impacted by settler colonialism and may have been forcibly removed. So this land acknowledgement allows us to place our own experiences and our own conversations around civil and human rights in this context of understanding what it means to be on land that had once been resided upon by a group of people who experienced marginalization and oppression as the indigenous people of this land. I'm going to take us through some basic terminology. I think you're seeing terms like anti-racist, anti-racism, anti-racist ideas everywhere. And I think it's really important that while, I'm going to always recommend books we should be reading, that while we are all sort of trying to get on the same metaphorical page of a book. So I often use diversity, equity, inclusion as an example of, like, sometimes we're in chapter 13, some of us are in chapter 1, and some of us haven't figured out what book we're reading. And in the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, we want to meet people where they are in their own learning and growth and development. But it's important to do that by sort of grounding for everyone what we're talking about when we talk about specific examples of things we like to aim for in our work. So there's something called the Equity Minded Toolkit and Glossary. This is like actually hyperlinked in my presentation. So I'm just going to click on our link and hope it works. This is a PDF file that we've shared and we will share again, but it just, so you can see it has an example of various terms that, that sort of are related to the concepts of anti-racism, and in particular fighting anti-Blackness, and terms like accountability, ally, understanding what it means to be anti-Black. Those sorts of things are linked in this racial equity toolkit. So I just wanted to show you that link, and we'll provide that link there, but I always embed it in this presentation. So I pulled these terms from this glossary. Anti-racism is defined as the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. This comes from a famous quote that many people will refer to by Angela Davis, and I'm sure I'll talk more about in our next session like this one. But this understanding of like what it means to be focused on anti-racism. So what does it look like to be an anti-racist? An anti-racist is someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas. This includes the expression or ideas that racial groups are equals and none needs developing, and a supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. So in particular, thinking about this idea that we are working on being anti-racist is something that we do intentionally. It is a praxis that is focused on freedom for all people. And praxis, I'm using Praxis or practice. It is not something that you do because you just woke up that day. You have to intentionally be engaged in this praxis to be considered a person who should, sort of own the label anti-racist. An anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests that racial groups are equals in all of their apparent difference and that there's nothing wrong with any racial group. Anti-racists argue that racist policies are the cause of racial injustices. So anti-racists are really focusing on, seeing this as a cause of racial justice. So I just wanted to walk through some of the basic terminology. I'm also going to show you now a video from two incredible theoreticians that study anti-racist philosophy. Ibram Kendi, who is now newly placed at Boston University, and Robin DiAngelo. Ibram Kendi has written a book called Stamped from the Beginning. He's also known, it's Stamped from the Beginning, The History of Racist Ideas in America, and also a follow-up book that is called How to Be an Anti-Racist. He's doing lectures all across the country. And Robin DiAngelo is also former faculty member, now really travels the country and the world talking about anti-racism, but specifically from studying the perspective of like white fragility, or what some people have called anti-aversive racism. So this idea that, being concerned, I guess, with being labeled racist has sometimes made people feel less comfortable with engaging on being anti-racist. And so I want you to hear from the two of them, and then I'm going to come back and talk about a couple of things to close out this first primer. And don't worry, we'll get to much deeper conversation around these topics in part 2. So I'll let Professors Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi speak.
The events in Minneapolis and the protests that followed have sparked some very difficult conversations about race. So we turn to two leading scholars and best-selling authors who've written extensively about race in America. Ibram Kendi is of Boston University, and Robin DiAngelo is from Washington University in Seattle. Ibram, what is a question you think white people should be asking?
I think if white people claim they are anti-racist, then they should be asking questions like, why is it that unarmed Black people are being killed by police, but armed white people are being arrested? Why is it that Black people are disproportionately dying of COVID-19? Why is there a growing racial wealth gap in this country? And to me, if you answer, well, because there's something wrong with Black people, then you're answering with a racist idea.
I would urge white Americans to remove the claim, I'm not racist, from our vocabularies. What are some of the excuses that you've heard when people say, I'm not racist because? Well, I've been to Costa Rica. I'm a vegetarian. I'm from Canada. I had a Black roommate in college. I was a minority in Japan, so I know what it means to be Black. It just goes on, and it's I saw something in your book that said, I marched in the 60s. My cousin is married to a Black man. Yeah. Most Black people I know, myself included, are hearing from their white friends who are asking for guidance about what they should do. How can they be better? Is that fair?
I think people, they don't have to go to that proximate Black friend in order for that Black person to teach them about racism, because first and foremost, not every Black person is an expert on racism.
Very fair point. Just because you're a person of color does not mean you're an expert on that topic. I offer white people this opening question. If their number one question is, what do I do? And that is, how have you managed to be a full functioning adult in 2020 and not know what to do? They're asking the question at this particular time because we just saw the very horrible murder of a Black man in a very graphic way at the hands of a police officer. Is that the point? Well, how many times have we seen a very graphic, horrible murder at the hands of a police officer? How many times have we reacted when Colin Kaepernick respectfully went down on one knee? Did we ask, help me understand why he would do that? Or did we attack him and invalidate him, and did he lose his job for that? What about family members? You know, it often comes up at the family dinner table. Everybody has an uncle, fill in the blank. I think most white Americans can relate to that family dinner when Uncle Bob says that thing and five people just cringe, but nobody says anything. Why would interrupting Uncle Bob's racism ruin your dinner, and not interrupting his racism not ruin your dinner?
Let me just say, Gail, when I was diagnosed with cancer, that hurt. It hurt me deeply. And I suspect when someone is diagnosed with being racist, it hurts them deeply. But I think they can trust the person who's giving them the diagnosis, someone who studies racism or a loved one, to say, I'm giving you this diagnosis because I want you to get better.
Do you think racism can be eliminated, Dr. DiAngelo? I don't believe it'll be eliminated in my lifetime, but niceness will not end racism. Only strategic, intentional, anti-racist action will end racism.
I believe that it will be one day. And
in your lifetime?
I don't know about my lifetime. I'm hoping my daughter's lifetime. But I think it's critical for us to recognize that the way we eliminate racism is by eliminating racial inequity and injustice. And we can change policies, just like we can change people, just like we can change people in positions of power. And I think it's critically important for people to realize that change is possible if we are willing to fight for it.
So we've listened to Dr. Ibram Kendi and Dr. Robin DiAngelo talk about some difficult topics around anti-racism and just understanding the moment that we've been in. I think when we first conceptualized having more conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been a part of an ongoing commitment of the college prior to my arrival, really. One of the reasons why the college decided to establish a chief diversity officer was to be more focused on being a more inclusive institution that had accountability measures in place, and sort of a vision for diversity, equity, inclusion as part of our strategic plan, yes, we had just come, off of some very, very difficult national and global climate issues around race relations. In particular, the shooting of 49 people in Pulse, Orlando, who were predominantly Latinx, LGBTQ people. The shootings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile also in the summer of 2016. And in addition to that, the 5 Dallas police officers that were killed just after that. It was a really tough time. And, honestly, it had felt like for years there had been very public ways that we had been watching things happen that were overwhelmingly familiar for many people. And in particular for people of color, and specifically African American people, Black people, there was this long history of experiencing racial oppression uniquely and specifically related to being Black and interacting with various state entities. And so one of the things that I wanted to lift up to close this first sort of snippet of talking about anti-racism as a primer is it is particularly important for us as a women's college to think about the Say Her Name movement. Even as we've been lifting up the names of the individuals who were killed or whose deaths have become part of the public discourse, more recently Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, many times there has also been an erasure of the Black women's voices and Black trans and gender nonconforming people's experiences who've also suffered harm or been killed. And it often has been attributed to race. So I thought I'd show you this Say Her Name graphic because there has been a movement by, in particular, activists, but those that are really focused on making sure that we don't further exacerbate gender tension and ignore the intersections of individuals' experiences by not lifting up also the names and voices of Black women who have been killed in particular. So this graphic, which we'll share with you, shows you sort of between 2014, 2020, deaths that did not get media attention. And they include people like Tatiana Jefferson, who was killed last fall when she was at her mom's house and playing video games with her nephew, and someone was concerned that her mom's back door was open, and when the police approached the home, they shot into the home and killed her as she was looking out the window. She was also unarmed, like so many of these folks are. And Breonna Taylor, who was most recently killed in her home. And these stories of these women who have not been included in the national discourse continue to help us think critically about the way that we should be thinking about being intersectional in our work towards being anti-racist. So when we are lifting up names, when we're lifting up experiences and stories to try to challenge racist ideas, we want to be intersectional in our approach in doing so by lifting up the names of Black women, Black femmes, Black trans and gender nonconforming people. So while there could be much conversation for us to talk about sort of the uprisings that have been happening globally around Black Lives Matter and that movement, I think one of the things I wanted to close with is to say that I know a number of you are watching this video and a part of this dialogue. Perhaps you have been engaged for a very long time. Perhaps you grew up in the United States or grew up outside of the United States and didn't really understand all of the reasons why these movements and these uprisings were occurring. Perhaps you've been engaged in these struggles for liberation for a long time. Wherever you are on this journey towards eradicating the human hierarchy, it is something that we need to do together. We need to do from a place of radical empathy for one another, and deepen understanding for one another. And I hope we can continue to do this work by being open minded and open hearted about the unpacking that we need to do of our own privilege and excoriating bias within ourselves individually, and do that tough work of addressing all of our own internal biases so that we can continue to do the collective work of fighting for each other's freedom together, so that we actually have the world that we want to create, and particularly a world that holds and lifts up Mount Holyoke College and then a multitude of alum from around the country and around the world who are doing incredible work to support the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion by just showing up every day intentionally anti-racist. So thank you for watching this. I'm excited to be on this journey with you. I can't wait to have more conversations and dialogues with you. And I hope you join me as we begin to continue to do this important work together. Thank you.